I would like to welcome everybody in this seventh panel at the May Day School 2014 classes on the periphery. This discussion will be mainly focused on the sector analysis, or if you want, on the class analysis of different sectors of the Slovenian peripheral economy. Now, on the European periphery, we can identify a number of social groups which are equally subordinated to the agents of capital, but all too often act independently of one another and do not recognize their common interest. We are faced with a fragmented workforce which is mostly incapable of unified political action despite an ostensibly univocal opposition against neoliberal policies. It is a fact that the basic conflict of contemporary societies, the one between the labor and capital, cannot be observed in its pure form anymore, and even less can it be used as a basis for political action. Hence, more attention should be paid to given to the conflicts and positions that take place within the exploited social groupings itself. And therefore, the objective of this panel will be to analyze the workforce fragmentation and the class character of the workforce in a specific sector of the Slovenian peripheral economy. The speakers will provide the case studies of Slovenian culture industry and the case study of Slovenian academia. The case study of Slovenian media industry will be left out this time because Igor Bobic from the Faculty of Social Sciences is sadly absent due to some unexpected and urgent personal inconveniences or circumstances. But I'm glad that I can present the other two speakers of this panel. Firstly, Katja Praznik, who is currently an assistant professor at the Buffalo University. She holds a PhD in sociology from the University of Ljubljana, and her current research focuses on the autonomy, labor legislation, and political economy in the arts during the demise of the welfare state. Our second speaker today, Primož Krašovec, an independent lecturer, translator, editor, and writer. He's currently teaching theory of ideology at the Faculty of Arts in the University of Ljubljana, and he is also currently translating the Socialist Alternative written by Michael Lebovitz. So we will base this discussion today on the point Igor Bobic was supposed to talk about, and this is the invasion of the market logic into different sectors of Slovenian economy and consequential precarization of workers, reduction of their social rights, decline of their mobilization power, and also decline of political relevancy of their work. Starting from here, we will touch upon two major points in this discussion. First, we'll analyze the specific legislation which contributed to the formation of class differences in the field of culture, the specific legislation which also institutionalized the precarious working condition in the field of culture. What is particularly contradictory and also interesting in this case is that this legislation was passed under the specific ideology of artistic autonomy, and Katja Praznik will also talk about that. And second, we'll scrutinize, in the second part of this discussion, we'll scrutinize the relevance of the class analysis, that sees class as a thing or a pseudo-natural property of certain social groups. Building on the dichotomy between intellectual and manual labor, Primož will try to proceed to the analysis of the relation of dominance in the Slovenian academia, while also tackling the seemingly subversive and, in Primož's opinion, naive defenses of the abstract pole of this antagonism. I think this is enough for the introduction, and without any further ado, I would like to invite the first speaker, Katja Praznik, to present her contribution. The stage is yours.
Hi, and thanks for coming and listening to this going to do is I'm going to talk about a little bit of history of the legislation that deals with artistic labor in Slovenia. And first I'm going to talk about the law that was actually accepted in early 80s. And then in the second part I will also try to focus on the issue of artistic autonomy and how that played into the problem of escalation of class differences and precarious working conditions. So my contribution, in this contribution I would like to offer a new reading of the nature of cultural policy and class relations in the cultural system in Slovenia as they manifested themselves during the transition from self-managed socialist Yugoslavia, particularly the 80s, to the independent nation-state in Slovenia. This is during the deconstruction of the welfare state and the ascent of neoliberalization. Zora Skušek remarked as early as in the 1980s in her introduction to the collection of texts by artisanal students on ideology and aesthetic effect that issues of class and class struggle in the realm of culture have been a point of contention and misapprehension because the agents of the cultural system either don't see the class struggle or they mechanistically trivialize it. Even though, as Skušek maintains, class struggle is present where one doesn't see it, in the most apparent self-evident obviousness that has nothing to do with politics. The fact that one doesn't see or overlooks the class disposition is, according to Skušek, a result of an already won class struggle, a result of a temporary victory of one of the opponents. What is interesting in this Skušek's remark is that on the one hand she points to the sort of mystification that takes place when one tries to understand the class disposition of various groups in a specific historical situation, while on the other hand we can see that the remark about the victory of one of the opponents belongs to the Slovenian School of Ideology Critique that was engaged in the exposure of ruling class exploitation and domination, as well as critique of ideological forms that make this domination appear as natural. However, in my contribution, I would like to align the problems of what I call spontaneous ideology of autonomy of the arts in the sphere of culture with issues of fetishism and mystifications as theorized by Michael Heinrich, a proponent of the New German reading of Marx, which importantly explains how fetishism of social relations in capitalist society constitutes a structural background that is always present, but affects individuals with varying strength. Therefore, in my contribution, I will demonstrate how the fetishism of social relations is affecting agents in the cultural system in Slovenia and how it obfuscates class relations and distinctions which are nevertheless present. And because some of the main elements for current or present-day precarious working conditions in Slovenia, which my analysis foregrounds, emerged already during the late 70s and early 80s, that is during socialist times. I have to make a couple of emphases about the premises on which my analysis is based on. And additionally, I also need to know that my contribution follows some of the recent analysis of socialist Yugoslavia that have demonstrated how Yugoslavia was in fact a socialist welfare state which didn't do away with exploitation, division of labor and value production. But it did, however, transform social and working relations and distribution of surplus value, all of which resulted in a more just society. Even before the 1980s, liberal tendencies in political economy were already present in socialist Yugoslavia. Rast Pomočnik suggests that beginning with the 1965 economic reform, the techno-liberal fraction of the League of Communists established the socialist market in Yugoslav political economy. The transition to capitalist mode of production thus started already during self-management times because, according to Galkir, socialist social formation comprised elements for the reproduction of capitalist mode of production, namely bourgeois law and state, commodity relations, wage labor and money. And of course this transition was not something very simple, but it was very complex. I'm not going to go into that here. Why I'm stressing this is that it is not surprising that although Slovenia was part of a socialist federation, the process of precarization of cultural producers already started in 1980s, when the socialist government, which officially still proclaimed self-management as the dominant ideology, introduced a special law for the independent cultural workers. And some form of this law is still in place today. From the time socialist Yugoslavia disintegrated via nationalistic wars into independent nation states in the 90s, socio-economic status of cultural producers progressively deteriorated. Precarious working conditions of cultural producers and the commodification of cultural labor that became apparent during the 90s could be said to be indicative of the emerging class differences within the cultural system. So I'm going to focus now on these premises about the position of art in socialist and present-day Slovenia, which my contribution is based on. First, I would like to emphasize that I think that no structural changes have appeared in the organizational logic of the cultural system during the transition from the self-managed socialist Yugoslavia to independent nation-state of Slovenia. Yugoslavia as well as independent Slovenia were both welfare states on the periphery of Europe, where public services like health, education as well as cultural production were understood as a public good. And then the second thing relates to the production of arts and culture, which in socialist Yugoslavia was structurally organized in a comparable fashion to Western European capitalist countries. Hence, it produced similar contradictions and phenomena. What I mean here is the claims for artistic autonomy. And these kind of problems are also present internationally in countries that could be defined as welfare states. So even though cultural production was publicly funded in socialist Yugoslavia due to particular institution of social property, the function of art practices in socialist Yugoslavia was not reconceptualized within this new social order. And this brings me to the third premise, the nature of the welfare state, which is relevant for the history of the cultural legislation for artistic labor and the escalation of class differences in Slovenia. And this pertains to Michael Heinrich's explanation about the nature of the welfare measures. Heinrich explains that state social welfare measures are usually contingent on the sale of labor power or the willingness to sell one's labor power, which was also the case in former Yugoslavia and later in Slovenia. Hence, cultural producers, by which I refer to artists and other arts professionals in the field of culture, were mostly wage laborers employed by public cultural institutions and paid through public funding until a new category of worker, the so-called independent cultural worker, was introduced in the early 80s. What I want to stress also is that public money for cultural production in Yugoslavia and in Slovenia was collected through taxes. And during the 80s, it was collected by the self-managed interest community via employers' so-called self-contribution, which was also a form of taxation in Yugoslavia. And this self-managed interest community, which was called the Cultural Community of Slovenia, then redistributed the money to cultural institutions as well as individual cultural producers. Today, this role is, of course, taken over by the Ministry of Culture and local governments. But it is nevertheless important to emphasize that the calculations regarding the amount of financial resources that would have been needed for cultural production during socialism were already made in the 50s and were based on the systematization of jobs and positions in cultural institutions. This means that with the growing number of young cultural producers and the declining number of newly established cultural institutions and stagnating cultural budget, the scarcity of resources for cultural production was inevitable, which I will go into that later. The other thing that I also want to emphasize is that we can see that the state apparatus had actually two functions concerning cultural production. It either operated as an employer of wage laborers in cultural institutions or as an investor in cultural production for individual cultural producers via copyright contracts. In the latter case, these independent cultural producers have found themselves in a disadvantaged socioeconomic position because their contributions to social security and healthcare schemes were lower than those of the employed arts professionals. Consequently, independent cultural producers have been entitled to fewer benefits of the welfare provision or sometimes even denied some of these workers' rights. And this then, of course, even deteriorated after the falling apart of Yugoslavia. So, in continuation, I'm going to focus on this law for independent cultural workers that could be understood as the neuralgic point in instituting precarious working conditions in the field of culture in the former socialist context, but also in the present-day context. That is, I will try to show how these juridical arrangements for cultural labor shape the material conditions of independent cultural producers and what kind of social relations they instituted in the sphere of culture. The gist of this cultural legislation still in place today represents not only the anchorage for indirect, formal, as well as real subsumption of cultural labor under capital, because it implicitly defines cultural producers as entrepreneurs. But also this legislation also forms the basis of class divisions and differentiations. As I will explain, these divisions arise from the unequal access to welfare provisions and legal incapacity for unionization. Both of these instances have affected the socio-economic position of independent cultural producers. And what is particularly contradictory about this legislation is that the law that is regulating cultural labor and economic standing of cultural producers was passed under the ideology of artistic autonomy and freedom, while it simultaneously disenfranchised cultural producers of their social and labor rights. As I mentioned, the law for independent cultural workers was introduced in socialist Slovenia in 1982. And it was primarily implemented to remedy the socio-economic condition and to legalize the status of freelance cultural producers. However, it was paradoxically set forth by way of providing artists the option to operate as so-called free enterprises in the framework of the socialist market. The law failed to improve socio-economic conditions and in fact legalized precarious working conditions for independent cultural producers. That is for all those who were not employed in public cultural institutions. The law has been subject to several changes during the 90s and during the 2000s, but most of them further increased the precarious working conditions of cultural producers. Symptomatically and tellingly, the designation for these cultural producers changed from the independent cultural workers, then to freelancers in the field of culture, and finally to the self-employed persons in the field of culture. These are the designations that the laws and then consequently what was important about this law during the 80s was that the law made it possible for these independent artists and professionals and cultural workers to operate legally and business-wise and to establish so-called temporary or permanent working communities. The independent cultural worker thus became a contractor of the cultural community of Slovenia by providing services for cultural users, but the state apparatus had an additional motive. It needed to take measures concerning the growing number of the working class youth, because, as Rastko Močnik asserts, the simple class reproduction started precisely at that historical moment to turn this working class youth into a superfluous industrial reserve army. Hence, the state apparatus invented a new category of worker. This new category of workers, independent cultural workers, were now legally bound to take care of their social security insurance, meaning healthcare and retirement provisions. Moreover, in order to be able to register as independent cultural worker, they had to meet a set of criteria set forth by the legislator and evaluated by a special expert committee. This was again necessary so that the state could keep control over the number of cultural workers that were granted the reimbursement of social security contributions. Nevertheless, before the break of socialist Yugoslavia, the welfare provisions were as a rule financed and paid by a social contract between these independent cultural workers and the cultural community of Slovenia, that is by public funds. And this arrangement is also still continuing to a certain extent, also in the framework of this nation state and today in Slovenia, where the Ministry of Culture, under certain criteria, is paying the social security benefits for selected cultural producers, yet the number of these persons that are entitled to the reimbursement is in inverse proportion to the growing number of registered self-employed cultural producers. And because this law actually enabled legal and business-wise operation of this freelance cultural work, it has been judged as an improvement in liberalization because it allowed these individuals and professionals to legally conduct their professional activities, and also in the sense that it granted the provision of social security insurance also to other professions in the field of culture. But in reality, the law only artificially recognized cultural producers by making a legal path possible for them to access the social security provisions, because the majority in the end and today has to self-fund these provisions. Even more importantly, the right for reimbursement of social security contributions was limited not only in terms of criteria specific to each profession, but also in terms of available public funds. And the fact of the matter was that the cultural budget, or the entirety of public funds available for cultural production, has been in principle stagnant. It is therefore not surprising that the number of independent cultural workers increased 2.8 times from 1979 to 1980, and in 1984, only 2 years after the implementation of the law, the number of cultural workers was 3 times higher. According to the statistics provided by Slovene Ministry of Culture, there were 2,278 self-employed persons in the field of culture in 2012. And furthermore, these self-employed persons in the field of culture, again according to the Ministry's calculations, represented 18% of agents in the cultural system, while 44% of agents in the cultural systems are so-called private cultural entrepreneurs. And they share some similarities with these self-employed people in the field of culture. So the superfluity of this reserve army of cultural labor becomes even more apparent if we contrast the previous data about the number of these independent cultural workers with the proportion of the cultural budget spent on the regular activities of public cultural institutions. That is for the employees' wages and the material expenses of those institutions, which amounted to 38% in 1984, and this proportion eventually became a disproportion by the end of the 80s, where this percentage of cultural budget for regular activities of public cultural institutions was 48%, and then in the 90s, the percentage, the last information that I have is for 1996, was 68% of the cultural budget was spent on regular activities of public cultural institutions. So that being the case, it is clear that one of the main effects of the law for independent cultural workers was to reduce the pressure on secure jobs, that is on permanent employment, in public cultural institutions. That is why I argue that the effects of this law have brought about the escalation of class differences in the field of culture by introducing an unequal treatment of artistic and cultural labor. This furthermore contributed to the animosities between the independent cultural producers and public sector employees in the sphere of culture. And these two groups can be seen as two different groups, even though they can both be considered also working class. But of course, one group has better working conditions than the other. But this antagonism between these two groups actually played itself out not on the level of production of culture, but on ideological level, where the alternative culture has been perceived as the opposition to the dominant national culture. The dominant national culture, the one which is produced in the public institution, and the alternative culture, which is today mostly produced in the NGO arena. So what I'm trying to argue is that this law, as a cultural policy measure, was in fact just an administrative maneuver, a legal arrangement that instituted a new type of cultural labor that was radically different from permanent full-time employment and that did not improve socio-economic conditions of independent cultural producers. Furthermore, this law weakened the welfare state in the cultural sphere, not because the social provisions for cultural producers wouldn't be available anymore, but because an unjust selection principle was implemented that made the welfare provisions available only to those who were employed. And, you know, for those who didn't earn enough money, the payment of this welfare and, the social security provisions is always a problem. So, the main issue of why this inequality actually came about was that the measure was never followed by an increase in the cultural budget, as is very often the case with cultural policy measures. The other problem was that this measure was never followed by any discussion about the labor rights for the cultural producers. Moreover, what the law didn't address at all was the possibility of unionizing. Not only did this law disenfranchise cultural producers from labor rights, it also deprived them of the grounds to organize in a union. If the employees of the cultural institutions had been organized and protected by unions, the independent cultural producers were not and are still not able to form a union because they are juridically defined as employers of themselves, self-employed. None of the amendments of the law that followed during the 90s and 2000 addressed this problem. Furthermore, organizing cultural workers in unions has been a constant political issue. As I already stressed, the main problem lies in this legal definition of independent cultural producers, or, if I put it in another way, independent cultural producers are in fact understood as cultural entrepreneurs that are supposed to make their living based on their business astuteness within a harsh competition for scarce public and even scarcer private funds. Ultimately, a process of precarization is unfolding, whereby this category of workers have entered into the self-exploitation mode, getting less and less payment for their labor and having less and less opportunities to even find funding for their projects. They have been left to exploit their so-called human capital, which is in the line with the neoliberal ideology, according to which individuals are responsible and accountable for their well-being, while the state is closing down its security and social solidarity networks. Okay, so now I'm coming to this third part about the artistic autonomy. So while in retrospect we can see how the law instituted precarious working conditions via juridical arrangement for the artistic labor, which could also be interpreted as a sign of future neoliberalization, it is interesting to look at the other side of the contradiction that this law produced. Namely, even though the law was based on the ideology of entrepreneurial freedom, this cultural policy measure was welcomed as a mechanism to increase the autonomy of artists and cultural producers, as it allegedly increased their chances of self-determination. That is, this law enhanced the so-called autonomy of cultural producers. It is in this instance that I would like to address the issue of artistic autonomy and come back to the questions of mystifications and the fetishism of social relations in capitalism as they manifest themselves in the sphere of culture. And we can observe this mystification if we look at how ideological forms obscure economic relations and class dispositions. With this new law, cultural producers were now no longer strictly bound to operate through state-established professional associations or as employers tied to cultural institutions, but could freely design their own projects and activities. And that is why the new law was well received and welcomed, because it provided a legal form for independent cultural labor, particularly for those type of cultural producers that couldn't be employed in cultural institutions. For instance, filmmakers and, let's say, visual artists are some of them. Because cultural producers could now participate, their professions independently, this allegedly supported their autonomy and freedom. Yet, I argue that this espousal was possible in a situation where the welfare state network was in full operation and where there were sufficient funds for cultural production. So this spontaneous ideology of freedom and autonomy, which was embraced but never contested by the agents in the cultural system, could therefore be one of the main motivations why during its implementation in the 80s, the cultural labor legislation remained unquestioned. The law that supported entrepreneurial logic was welcome as a bearer of freedom, even though it was reproducing relations of exploitation and inequality in the cultural system. Instead of democratization of the mechanisms of the welfare state and mechanisms of mutual solidarity, this law introduced the every woman for herself line of reasoning. This rationale contributed to the hegemony of self-precarization in the cultural system. However, as neoliberal policies become pervasive during the 90s and the welfare state has slowly but surely been dismantled, which we can see today, and with the dismantlement of the welfare state, also the problem became of the access to wages for cultural producers. This type of self-employment that is based on precarious working conditions is not anymore a choice, if it ever was, but it is in fact forced upon cultural producers. That is to say, even if the agents in the cultural system appear to be autonomous and independent, cultural labor is becoming increasingly subordinated to the logic of capitalist exploitation and capital accumulation. Hence, there is a contradiction as well as mystification connected to these claims of artistic autonomy. So at this point, I think for my discussion of artistic autonomy, I need to draw a distinction between culture as ideological production and culture as economic production. Culture can be said to be autonomous on the level of production of ideological science, yet on the level of the production, it is permeated by capitalist tactics and patterns. Furthermore, as we can see on this Slovenian case and position of cultural workers, cultural sphere within a welfare state is in fact formally subsumed under capital. And I mentioned at the beginning that most of the cultural production in Slovenia has been financed via state apparatus, that is via public funds, and is part of this public sector or understood as a public good. And even in the case of NGO that legally belong to the realm of private sector, their programs are mostly funded by public funds, local, state, or from the European Union. So this law for the independent cultural workers, as well as its legal successors in the current present days, are in this respect the key element that enables this process of formal subsumption of cultural labor under capital, because the law has regulated and introduced new legal procedures in the market for cultural labor. Formal subsumption of cultural labor hence manifests itself in juridical arrangements that started the precarization of cultural labor. Furthermore, because this new regulation of cultural labor instituted unequal access to social security provisions and relative denial of labor rights, which went along with the stagnation of public funds for cultural production, this further contributed to the limited and unstable access to wages and hence for subsistence of these independent cultural producers. This is why the law had an effect on class differentiations in the sphere of culture as well as on levels of dependency of cultural producers. Even more, the fact that the law was well received and that it was understood as a procedure that enhanced artistic autonomy shows us how the ideology of the artistic autonomy obscures the indirect formal subsumption of cultural labor under capital. However, this is not a phenomenon specific only for post-socialist contexts. This tends to be a global issue because today cultural producers are still concerned with artistic autonomy, which in my view contributes to the misrepresentation of the relations of production and obscures the socio-economic realities in the cultural sphere. This is why I argue that artistic autonomy is in fact a structural disavowal of the socio-economic context. And I hope I managed to demonstrate how, in the Slovenian case of this law for the independent cultural workers, artistic autonomy functions as a kind of spontaneous ideology that mystifies these economic relations. And one of the effects of this spontaneous ideology of artistic autonomy is obfuscation of economic foundations of art production. This mystification, which furthermore obscures also the class differentiations in the cultural sphere, can be said to happen because cultural producers understand the relative autonomy of art on the level of ideological production as autonomy of their production process. And I need to emphasize also at the end that I don't see claims for artistic autonomy as a false consciousness, but I just would like to think about it as an unproductive political tactic because it separates the sphere of culture from the issues of larger socio-economic changes that are necessary if we want to talk about the capitalist mode of production and how to change it. Claims for autonomy, as I hope that I have demonstrated in the case of this law for independent cultural workers, are shifting attention away from the problem of wage labor and are contributing to the mystification whereby the autonomy of art on the ideological level obscures the fact that culture is in fact formally subsumed under capital. But of course then the next question is what are we, how should we think about this independent cultural production, and I hope we can have some discussion afterwards about these questions. Thank you.
Katja, a fine presentation, and now, as already mentioned, Primož, the stage is yours.
Thank you. I have divided my talk in three basic parts. In the first part, I will try to introduce, it will be very general, introductory, and it will be general in the sense that it applies to any public university, not just Slovenian one or Slovenian ones, in which I will try to add another dimension that I think that was at least locally lacking from recent analysis of recent student and other university struggles. So this will be the introduction. The second part of my talk will be some critical thoughts or remarks on, let's say, political articulation of recent student and university struggles. And the concluding part will be about some class and class-related issues connected to the university. So on with the introduction. My question in this part of my talk will be what makes university as an institution special, in the sense what differentiates university from other social institutions in general and from other public institutions in particular. What is its specific social place or location? And I will begin to answer this question by using Alfred Zollner-Retter's approach from his book Intellectual and Manual Labor. So this will also be this new dimension that I've mentioned that I will try to introduce into analysis of university studies. So the dimension of the social division of labor between intellectual and manual labor. So Alfred Zollner-Retter's investigation into this topic of the division between intellectual and manual labor begins or is focused on the concept of real abstraction originating from market exchange, meaning developed or generalized market exchange in capitalist societies. And as all the readers of the chapter on the fetish character of commodity from the first book of Capital already know, in the very moment of exchange, of market exchange in capitalism, the commodity is stripped off of all its sensual material properties, is reduced in order for the very act of exchange to be possible. Commodity has to be reduced to its supersensuous dimension, has to function exclusively as value expressed in money, as this purely social abstract property of the commodity. And this abstraction, and Alfred Zonneretel keeps emphasizing this point throughout his book, it's a real objective social abstraction, happening in real social activity or process of exchange. So it's not a mental abstraction. It's not something that happens within individual consciousness, but actually happens out there in social processes or in social relation of exchange. But this real social abstraction originating in exchange, on the other hand, allows for a specific mental abstraction, according to Zonneretel, for specific mental abstractions to develop. So basically, everything that is excluded in the moment or in the process of exchange, so all material sensuous qualities or properties of the commodity are included or are subjected to another process of abstraction, this time mental abstraction, and his Zonneretel sees in these basic social conditions for the development of modern scientific thought or abstract reasoning, abstract thinking. So in market societies or in developed capitalist societies, nature can appear as pure object world, can become externalized precisely because in the process of exchange, this purely social moment, purely socially abstract moment of this activity remains unknown. So nature, everything that is excluded or stripped off from the commodities in exchange, can appear as an object of mental abstraction. So everything that is basically excluded by a real social abstraction can become an object of mental abstract conceptual thought. Modern, and according to Zonneretel, this is the basic social condition for the birth of modern scientific abstract and conceptual way of thinking. So basically, this is how Zonneretel connects the development of capitalism and market society, market exchange, to end a basic development of basic social conditions for modern science as a special way of thinking, as a special way of producing knowledge, and as a special way of mentally appropriating the outside world, are connected or proceed simultaneously. So this is how we can, in a sense, derive the basic social conditions for the development of modern science from the process of generalized market exchange. And now this is the end of this summary of Zonneretel. Now we'll go the other way and proceed from modern science or modern scientific thought, and try to connect it to the capitalist production. So far I was talking only about the sphere of exchange. Now I'll try to connect science to the process of capitalist production. And this process or this connection is basically, if maybe we can introduce now university as an institution. So university is the institution in modern developed capitalist society where science as abstract conceptual thought is produced, and then a connection between this type of abstract scientific reasoning and capitalist production is a process of technological application. So technological application is the link that connects production of knowledge in university and production of commodities in the capitalist economy. So here a question of why is technological application of science so important for the capitalist economy can be posed, or even imposes itself. So there are basically six reasons. I will not explain them all, I will just state them, so to drag this introduction for too long. Three of them are related to the competitive requirements or demands of individual private enterprises, and those are technological improvement or innovation, which require the development of modern science. Firstly, cheapen the produced goods. Secondly, allow for increased productivity, so allow for faster production of said goods. And thirdly, technological innovations can improve the quality of produced goods. And all three factors combined provide competitive advantage for individual private enterprises, either as increased market share or extra profits, or a combination of both. This is why private enterprises in capitalism need science in its technologically applied form. And now there are three also general social conditions. This is why capital. These are three reasons why capital needs science and its technological applications or rather how technological application of science improve general conditions for capital accumulations. And these three reasons or factors are technological application and the development of industrial machinery allows for real subsumption of labor under capital. So it subsumes the workers under the rhythm of the machines, which tends to increase their discipline and allows for better surveillance of the working process, better surveillance and control of the working process. It also general social increases in productivity over time tend to decrease the general social value of the labor force, tend to cheapen the workers' means of consumption, which means it can also allow for wages to decrease, or at least to be stagnant. That of course depends on the state of the class struggle, but in a sense this material, not moral or historical component of the value of labor force tends to decrease with the increases in general social productivity. And thirdly, the development of technology, of science and technology in capitalism can, in certain cases, in certain social and historical circumstances, lead to technological redundancy, whereas machines replace workers and make them redundant, which also means objective pressure on wages and working conditions. So the more there are workers that are unemployed or technologically redundant, the more employers can pressure the workers that remain employed and pressure their wages, try to reduce the cost of wages and so on. So this was the introductory part, which we can summarize by pointing out two main points that make university as an institution special. One is that it does not merely carry out as other institutions and other public institutions, and also private enterprises do. Unlike them, the university does not merely carry out the division between intellectual and manual labor, but produces and reproduces this division itself. So university is the institution and the only institution in capitalist societies that produces this distinction, which then spreads throughout all of other institutions and private enterprises. So this is the first thing that makes university special. The second is that it is socially placed, or its social location is at the intersection between the reproduction or expanded reproduction of the workforce. So people get educated, they get new skills, they're more productive or more useful for capital or for the employers. So this is one dimension of what university is doing in capitalist society, and on the other hand, it is part of basic social infrastructure. So it produces both education for workers, which makes them more qualified, productive, useful for capital, and so on. And on the other hand, it produces the scientific knowledge itself, or pure, basic, abstract theoretical science, which is part of basic social infrastructure. If or when technologically applied, is useful for capitalist enterprises in the manner I've just outlined. So, if we take this perspective of the special structural social location of the university and its role of not just reproducing but producing the very division between intellectual and manual labor, we can see that basic institutional infrastructure, basic institutional structure of the university, its very basic institutional architecture is a materialization of this special place and special role it has in capitalist societies. And the universities tends to be, this varies across the countries, but they tend to be institutionally, internally divided, precisely corresponding to the division between intellectual and manual labor, or more, to put it more concretely, they tend to be divided on the research parts, which is meant for the production of abstract, theoretical, scientific knowledge on the one hand, and on the other hand is the pedagogical part, which serves to equip future workers with bundles of more concrete workplace related skills. So this research part produces and carries out the intellectual labor part, while the pedagogical part where you do not work in the laboratory researching and producing science, but the part where you work with students and transmit science, and the part which is more oriented toward, or tends to be more oriented towards the labor market, corresponds corresponds within the university to manual labor, or at least equipment, let's say mental equipment for future manual laborers, which are not manual laborers in a sense that classical industrial or agricultural laborers are. Most industrial or agricultural laborers, the manual in this common sense perception, do not have university education. So the distinction is basically between purely abstract scientific thought on the one hand, and more concretely founded or concretely informed way of thinking, based on concrete experience. That doesn't mean that when I talk about manual labor here, I'm thinking about these distinctions. So not really about who is working with hands and who with their head, but those two different types of thinking. So intellectual in this sense means just thinking abstractly, conceptually, in a scientific way, while, let's say, thinking manually means you base yourself on concrete life experience and so on. So I would say this is perhaps one of the most important institutional divides within the university. So research and teaching, or pedagogical part. And there's also an important neoliberal modification of this basic institutional arrangement, whereas at least in Slovenia, this is a local example connected to the new law on higher education. This whole law can be read as an attempt to socialize also the costs of technological application of science. So if previously in previous social arrangement, let's say welfare state or Keynesian, you want to call it, situation, university was mainly responsible for production of pure or basic scientific research, and technological application was carried out of this pure abstract science was carried out and financed by private enterprises, by their own internal in-house research and development departments. Now there's a tendency, at least in Slovenia, for quite some years now, at least 4 or 5 years, to socialize the very costs of technological application as well. So this basic, through various new legal measures and under pressure, of course, from business and industrial lobbies. So this basic institutional divide between research and teaching can also be modified and changes historically. It's not an historically immovable structure. So now, with that in mind, I would like to proceed to already mention 3 critical points. So this is the third part of my talk. The already mentioned 3 critical points regarding political articulation of struggles. I think this political articulation of recent years, let's say from 2011 to 2014, when there was a marked jump in the intensity of university struggles in Slovenia, or at least at the University of Ljubljana, I think they can benefit somewhat from this added dimension of looking at them through lenses of social division between intellectual and manual labor. And I think this can serve to dispel some mistaken ideas of dubious political stances or positions that kept reappearing kept spontaneously reappearing in the last 3 years, both on some had also on the part of the student movements, but more frequently on the part of, let's say, academic or teachers movement and their trade union movement and so on. So my first critical point or remark would be that if this perspective of intellectual division between intellectual and manual labor can help to destabilize, unfortunately, quite common perception that the student body is divided between critical-minded students on the one hand, and on the other hand, on passive, materialistic, self-interested students. I think this division, first is moralistic, and second is completely politically irrelevant, because it is basically what is it is a moralistic description of micro-sociological tension between different lifestyles of those students who plan or who are aiming to assume positions within the university, and those looking to find a job outside. So critically minded, active, and so on students tend to be those who are aiming to take to assume a position within the institution that produces intellectual labor of capitalist society, while those that are more practical-minded, materialist, and so on, aim to take or plan to take position outside of this institution. So, considering this is quite natural that their lifestyles and modes of thinking diverge, and I think it's quite politically dangerous to put all your hopes on this critically minded, active, and so on part of the students. I think both of these attitudes have to be taken into account, and the second attitude cannot be just monolithically dismissed out of hand. They both have to be taken into account as let's say, as sociological expression of real differences in lives and positions and future plans of those students, and none of them is better or worse as a political starting point. So this would be my first critical remark. The second would be an also a problematic division between defenses of the autonomy of the university on the one hand, and the applicability or connections with the economy on the other hand. because since the university is located at the intersection of providing science as a part of basic public or social infrastructure and reproduction of the workforce, and since as an institution it produces the social division between intellectual and manual labor, the university has to necessarily combine and juggle both sides. So both the abstract knowledge, which serves to develop science itself as science, and the applied knowledge, which is transformed into bundles of workplace-related skills. So this division, this tension, can sometimes be antagonistic, but can never be abolished. I mean, as long at least cannot be abolished before the communist revolution. So I think the hysteria that recent neoliberal reforms try to abolish basic science in the name of only applied workplace-related skills. This type of hysteria is completely unfounded, because without the development of basic science, there would also be no technological applications and no workplace, and no new workplace, improved workplace-related skills to teach at the university. So basic science will never be abolished. So contrary, this would be my critical remark, contrary to interpretations which were very common a couple of years ago within the Slovenian academia, that neoliberal reforms are basically some kind of anti-intellectual or anti-theoretical or anti-scientific barbarism, kind of a neoliberal conspiracy to destroy critical and independent thought, and so on. I think the problem with the recurring state attempts to somehow marginalize the basic science part and expand and finance more the let's say applied part of the university. The reason why this is so lies somewhere else, not in the conspiracy of neoliberals bent on destroying critical intellectuals. The problem has to do with basic economic ways of basically with economic history of Slovenia, with its let's say quite special path of economic development, especially in the 90s, and on its relative position of its national economy relative to the world economy, or the world market on the one hand, and the economy of the neighboring or nearby countries. And if you consider the fact that most of Slovenian heavy industry was either destroyed or at least diminished significantly during the privatization process of the 90s, and if you take into account that the new adopted model during the 90s and also 2000 was the light industry export-oriented low-tech production, there even if you produce a lot of new science in Slovenia, there is no way, at least nationally, to apply it. So even if you want to be as useful to capital as possible, there is no way where you can technologically apply this newly produced science, because there's no industry into which you can apply it. Or the classic industrial sector has diminished rapidly, and I think this is reflected in the tendency for the state or the Ministry of Science to keep decreasing the importance and the finance of the basic scientific research, and trying to expand the applied part of the university, or more directly economically useful part. So I think also, besides that, also the naivety of this position, whereas you defend basic or abstract science from encroachment from capital, overlooks the naivety of this position is that it overlooks that basic science is no less basic or abstract or theoretical science, is no less useful to capital, only in another way than, let's say, teaching workplace-related concrete skills and so on. So this was my second critical point, and my third critical point would be also quite naive and politically dubious posing of the opposition between humanities as the beacon of critical and independent thought versus technical sciences on the other hand, like those hopelessly corrupt and depraved and sold their souls to capital, and so on. I think that's quite. The political problem of this division is that it immediately antagonizes people who come from natural sciences or from technical faculties, so you can no longer depend on them or include them in your projects, in your movements. But it is also naive in a sense that it presupposes that there is something inherently subversive about or critical about humanities as themselves. So it's quite fetishistic in the sense that it presupposes that there is some inherent property or ahistorical property of humanity that just emanates critical thought, which has to be shielded from the encroachment of technical knowledge or technical science, and also the persistence and widespreadness of Heideggerianism in Slovenia is also not completely unrelated to this type of thinking. So, but if you look at the development of humanities, both locally and in general, historically, we see that they are not subversive by themselves. That actually it's quite the opposite. So, regarding humanities were, let's say, places of critical thought and that also connected with revolutionary political projects, those of Yugoslav socialism or communism, only in certain historical periods, and only when these revolutionary projects were already going on, already taken place. So, for local academic sphere or for local departments of humanities, if you look at them historically, there is an oscillation and tension between this, let's say, revolutionary or critical orientation, which produces, which used to produce communists and socialist intelligentsia of socialist era, and on the other hand, already during socialism, humanities were also a place where something that would be called middle class in a sociological or Bourdieuian sense was being produced and reproduced. When I say in a Bourdieuian or a sociological sense, I mean because of quite obvious reasons, because private property of the means of production was prohibited during socialism. Class formation took on another forms, or was done by different social processes, and I think that Bourdieuian concept of, let's say, class differentiation by distinction of culture actually applies fully only to socialism, where there is no where the economic component or dimension of class formation is not the dominant one, because you cannot just have a class of private owners of means of production, but still you have social differentiation, still you have social hierarchization, which is mostly, at least in urban centers like Ljubljana, at least relatively in Slovenian context. I mean, it's far from being an urban center in wider context, but if you limit yourself to Slovenia, you could see, especially from the 70s on, that this revolutionary critical impulse in the humanities was being, with time, was being replaced by this formation of the distinguished let's say, petit bourgeois in a sociological, not political, economic sense, and humanities tended to lose their critical edge, and were becoming more and more elitistic, self-sufficient, and less political, at least in any left-wing progressive sense. So current panic, where people who are teaching at the humanities protest against neoliberalism in the name of their spiritual excellence and spiritual value, needs to be seen in this class formation context, because now you obviously can have capitalist class formation by having control over private control over the means of production. So this type of, let's say, petit bourgeoisie, which survived longer in the socialist periphery, precisely because it was the only way for burghers or town dwellers to extol themselves socially, is now becoming more and more redundant. So when people from the humanities protest neoliberalism, they don't do it because they're progressive or subversive or left-wing. They're just panicking because their historical time has passed. And I don't really see why any left-wing socialist and communist movement would want to preserve this type of petit bourgeoisie, distinct cultural, Bourdieuian cultural distinction making. So quite the opposite. Humanities has to be, the place of humanities has to be precisely rethought in a way that would allow for critical thought of this more, let's say, classic communist intellectual type kind of way. So I think I had some other points, but we've gone on too long.
I thank Primož for his presentation, and now I will open the debate for the public. So if anybody wants to ask a question or just pose a comment, okay, here we have the first one.
So thank you both, but a comment for Katja, and I didn't hear half of Primož's because I was thinking so much about how to phrase this. I didn't write it down, so I may miss something, but I wanted to make a comment on, you used the concept of formal subsumption, and now of course in a being pedantic, in a technical sense, that would mean, well, that whatever labor process or whatever production process is subsumed under capital, meaning that the logic of the profit motive is introduced. So it is, by definition, commodity production for profit, and then if it's capitalist, it includes, of course, exploitation. So that would be the classical definition. So, but you used formal subsumption, but still at the same time mentioned that it is primarily still funded from public funds and so on and so on. So what I would then, and also the very problem, of course, if we treat the problem of formal subsumption consequently, and you mentioned Heinrich, well, Heinrich, for example, mentions explicitly artistic labor, that it does not fall under the law of value, because these are by definition singularities. They're inexchangeable. That is like what an object of art means in our cultures and societies, and it is valued because of its singularity. So it's the law of value does here not apply. But I understand where you're coming from. I think one can say that certain mechanisms which have been developed through capitalist production, not only informal but even real subsumption, the very changing of the labor process, or as is or precarization. Precarization as a certain, as well as the condition, as a defining condition of a proletarian, of the proletarian existence, in terms of your dependence on the wage form and so on, and that certain mechanisms of dependence, of internal competition, which have been developed under capitalism, have then been universalized and transferred into even regulating something which is not, by definition, capitalistic production. Be it the university, if it's still a public one, be it allocation of funds, to introduce these mechanisms which can be seen, okay, they are derived from the logic of capitalism, but then applied to a sector where you don't have strictly, a capitalist mode of production and so on. And this is what I was thinking about this, I thought, well, maybe even certain aspects of what we see as a real subsumption can be applied to the cultural field in the broader sense. But then you will have to appreciate there are certain forms of cultural production which can be organized capitalistically, but and maybe even we all know what I mean. But art, in terms of creation of objects of art, by definition, would not fall under this. But even in art, for example, you can have, for example, there is something which we could call something which functions according to the logic of the process of terrorization, or what real subsumption entails. For example, you have a conceptual artist; he is the authorial subject, and to make his happening or whatnot performance happen, he needs to have 200 people who actually do the work. Those people, can be, there is a division of labor internally even. They can be paid or not paid, or miserably paid, and so on and so on. We see that much of cultural or artistic production in the emphatic sense depends on the labor of such people. And they may, by their education, technical competences, be quite equal to the authorial great artist or authorial subject, but it is only his signature, which makes this an object of art. And he is selling, this monopoly object, his specificity and signature. And maybe that will be even a reason why all these attempts to cancel the author, the authorial subject, are structurally doomed to fail, because what differentiates art from a nice object that someone else, someone did, I did or you did or whatnot, from the pissoir of the Champ or someone else, is precisely the signature. It's the signature and its monopoly. So one was basically a sort of a terminological and conceptual remark, and the others are basically just suggestions which were directly inspired by what you said. So.
Okay, you asked a lot of things, so I'm going to try to, discuss. I think that, while I was thinking about how to conceptualize all this, I had also some problems, and I already, I discussed it with Primož at one point, how to conceptualize all this. And one thing I think that I would like to stress, even about Marx or about Heinrich, I think that these people just don't actually really study the art production and the artwork to this extent that they would. I think they have a romantic view of art, so that's why they dismiss it. My view is that art as a practice, I try to see it very historically. So I think that the way we understand art production today is actually inherently connected with the rise of the capitalist mode of production. So I view art as a historical.
Okay, so that's not the same that it is capitalistic.
Yeah, I know. But just, because of that, I think that there is then a problem of, thinking about art as something which is, either trans-historical, universal, or something like that. And that's why I'm trying to think about it. In what way is art or art production or cultural production actually related to capitalist mode of production?
But I just using categories which are specifically devised to understand the capitalist mode of production.
Yep.
This is the form of production. That is my problem, not the rest of it.
I just think that I think they are still valid, because if you think about maybe my apparatus is completely dead, like too rigid, and that's the problem. I agree, but I'm thinking if the state plays a role in the capitalist mode of production, production of surplus value, and then this, surplus value gets redistributed to various different sections of society, and one of them is also art. Then you can talk about formal subsumption. That was my understanding, and that's why in the first place I want to talk about formal subsumption because I don't think, but certain, like you said, certain cultural production can totally be organized in a very capitalistic way, like film production or music production, you have always these distinctions, and I think that's why, I was trying to somehow also see how I can, if this was in a way testing of the concept, if it could be applied and if it makes any sense, if it actually tells me something about the way cultural production is organized. Because my main problem is always the autonomy, It's like, why do artists, why do cultural producers always call upon this autonomy, which I understand can be understood as something emancipatory because you want to get rid of these pressures of, like you say, of different patterns or like different techniques that get applied to the art. But I still find it very unproductive for let's say for a political struggle of, how do you think about art as something which is integral part of the society, which is not just a decoration, because I think that in bourgeois societies, art is, on one hand understood as a decoration, and on the other hand, it always hides a certain type of, accumulation that can be linked to the art, but it's always obscure because this is, something for,
I agree with almost everything you say now. So my suggestion is simply the terminology. You don't need that term to describe this, and even by trying to replace it, you really supposed to develop more nuanced ways of getting
Yeah. No, that's great. Yeah. No, I totally agree. So, thanks.
Primož, would you like to add something? Because I saw you wrote something down, no? Okay. Okay. Then I know, I see we have another question.
I have a small comment for Primož. I'm not certain if I understood your second critical point. I believe it was the second critical point about the basic and the applied sciences. I would agree in a way with what you said. There is no hidden agenda or some kind of neoliberal conspiracy against the basic sciences and in favor of applied sciences. And definitely in the context of some peripheral states and small economies, it is quite logical that applied sciences would have some form of, would get better treatment because of the struggle with the whole economic context. If I understood what your idea was, but I wouldn't really agree with the idea that the basic sciences in general in capitalism would have the same treatment or the same role because of its contribution to the capitalistic accumulation. Of course, they do contribute, and in that sense are definitely supported by capitalistic systems. So they would produce new machinery or something else that would improve the accumulation process. But I believe that you could really make a strong argument that basic sciences really didn't have. Didn't really achieve what was achievable during, for example, past 100 or 150 years of modern scientific revolution, precisely because of capitalism. There was an article by David Graeber, although I do understand that he really struggles with Marx, but he said some really good points about how the technology the development of technology actually spectacularly failed in the last 50 years. And that's maybe the point that should be mentioned, because people in that cultural hipster kind of way, you have your new iPhone or something, you believe it's some kind of a great technological advance. But the reality of modern consumer technology is that it's really not that. There is nothing new, revolutionary, scientific about it. It's really rehashing of really, really old ideas. And the point could be made that the basic sciences did really get the shaft, you know, the shorter end of the stick in the last 150 years. Even you have even scientists in America who are USA who are seeing that that even the imperial part of basic sciences that United States were putting forward during the Cold War is now gone. You know, like trip to the moon or something like that. You have those kind of sciences now in CERN being supported by a number of nation states that collaborate on huge basic scientific researches, which are in no way, at least at this point, in no way they don't contribute to capitalism. So you have scientists in the United States who see that as a problem because the United States drastically slashed the funds for the basic sciences, and in that way stopped the development of basic sciences in the United States during the last 50 years or even more. So I wouldn't really say that, of course, there is a neoliberal conspiracy about it, but that it's really a kind of a shifting thing. When it's opportunistic, then there are funds. Where it's not, when there is a place to market existing technologies, it's going to really stale even in the long term. So, although that wouldn't be, trying to put forward the left liberal argument about university as being a place where the basic sciences and in the old university sense should be studied with no constraint and so on. It's not that kind of an argument, but basically an argument about development, which is, I believe, in capitalism really, in technological and scientific sense, is being constrained for the last 50 or maybe even more years.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I don't really agree with Gregor's view that technology has failed. I think he often has not just struggles with Marx, but has very moralistic perception. I mean, in the last 150 years, it succeeded spectacularly in making workers disciplined, in improving surveillance over the workplace, which everybody who's worked in the last 10 years, of course, knows how improved is this surveillance, especially if you compare it with the previous generation, who had much before the advent of video cameras, online screen monitors, and so on. They had a much easier time at work, so they were under surveillance each minute and each second. So, of course, from the perspective of everyday life, it has failed. It has failed because capital is developing, because the system, because capitalism as such is failing, is a failed system, but not from the perspective of capital. It's quite useful. Of course, not in this strictly determinist functionalist way that everything that is developed perfectly fits some need or demand. Of course, there are deviations, failed attempts, and retracing steps, and so on. But I think, as a general development, I think this is a perspective that you have to take into account. Of course, from the perspective of our unmediated and unalienated full lives, technology is failing, but from the perspective of capital accumulation, it's not perfectly useful, but it's quite useful. On another point, but this is a minor point, on another point between the relation on basic and applied science, I was actually implicitly arguing against the view that basic science, or defending basic science is inherently good, and that anything that is applied or connected to the economy or the world outside the university is inherently bad. I just wanted to show that they're necessarily connected, and in capitalist societies you cannot abolish one or another, but it depends on historical circumstances and concrete situation and social circumstances how much emphasis will be put on one pole or another. I just wanted to let's say criticize this Manichaean dichotomy where one is light and the other is dark, and you defend it, because there's nothing inherently progressive about defending basic science, and I think what is even more problematic, there's nothing inherently left-wing or progressive in criticizing applied science as such, or applied technology. I think this is the second part of this criticism is even more important, this discussion always reminds me on Michael Polanyi's episode, this liberal epistemologist who was strictly in favor of the autonomy of science, and who was strictly, and he was one of the first neoliberal epistemologists, but he was strictly for the autonomy of science and against any applied science, or at least against any direct connection between science, basic pure science, and the economy. And he went in the 30s, he went to visit European Soviet Union, where he met with Bukhari. Bukhari told him there's no pure science in socialism. So this tells you that these relations between autonomy and application of science depend on the historical and social circumstances. I mean, I'm very much in favor of applying science to socialist, democratically planned economy, but I'm quite reserved about withdrawing funding from theoretical research and giving it to technological applications, which are in favor of capital. So this really depends on the situation. There are no ahistorical poles that you can just choose.
You have another question?
Yes, I want to comment exactly on this dichotomy that you made emphasize between basic and applied sciences. And I think it's only an analytical category. I don't think it should be used in this way to decide whether we should put money into basic science or applied science, because the results of the basic science can only be seen in applied sciences given the time period past that some patents can come to realization. And I think the best example with what's problematic with this dichotomy and what's problematic with the way basic sciences are treated nowadays is the example of pharmaceutics, which especially in the United States, all applied pharmaceutical researchers are financed by public funds, but these public funds are not given to, are not always, or not even mostly given to the public universities, but are given to private companies. And then these private pharmaceutical companies created these medicines, for example, for curing cancer and so on, but they patent it, and it gets really expensive. So the state conditions giving the money for this basic research in a manner that they can then create this generic medicine, which they sell under cheaper prices. And I think that maybe if this is what you were criticizing, then I agree. But if you're criticizing the mere financing of basic sciences as such, just because they don't have neposredno or recent application in society, then I don't think this is a good. I don't think this is a good objection, especially taking into account that most patents are created by the public funding, and even if we take into account the division between, for example, again, USA and public universities and Ivy League universities, most patents are held not by Ivy League universities, but by public universities. And I think this is, all of these things should be bear in mind when we try to make this dichotomy between basic sciences and applied sciences last. The problem and the antagonism that applied sciences cause is exactly this, that they are cheaper, and that putting too much funding into applied sciences and removing the funding from basic sciences is what creates this antagonism inside the academic field. And also this process that you criticize is only half of the process. Another part of the process, which I haven't articulated but I implied, is that the reduced funding for the basic sciences doesn't simply disappear, but it goes into private companies that then create profit out of it. So these are the crucial problems, I think, and I think that this dichotomy, whether if applied or basic, is false, and I don't think we should be falling into it.
Yeah, of course, I wasn't criticizing financing of basic science in any way. I'm sorry if it came off that way. It surely wasn't my intention. I was just saying there are no a priori historical criteria on which you could base, like applied good, basic bad, or vice versa. They just don't exist, they depend on that. So it's a false dilemma, really, if you look at it in this historical way. So you have to do this type of fine-tuned social analysis, and then you know what is politically correct.
Thank you. Another question there?
Thank you. I cannot agree that the status of independent cultural workers is to blame for precarization in the field of culture. Because two-thirds of independent cultural workers enjoy social benefits paid by state. That means that these workers are entitled to pension and to health security. And in comparison to other precariat, they are in completely different position. What is the problem, to my mind, is that this independent cultural workers' status is a camouflage for unemployment in the field of culture. And this is another problem. And on the other hand, we can witness in cultural institutions a kind of sclerosis. The average age of public servants employed in these cultural institutions is 47 years. These institutions are closed for new generations. So, to my mind, the main problem is how to open cultural institutions. That is the only modus vivendi that guarantee some stable conditions for cultural production. How to open these institutions for new generations. Thank you.
I didn't go into detail. I agree with you that the status of the freelance artist is actually a cover-up for unemployment. I mean, at least this is the case now. But I still think that the problem comes from, and even though if some of them are paid these social contributions, there are ridiculous limitations to when they are paid these their contributions. So there is like a financial census, and if they earn more than I think if they earn less than, that the census is around like 12 average Slovenian wages, which I think it's around 12 or 20,000 euros. So if they don't earn more, if they earn more than that, they're automatically not entitled to be. They have to provide it by themselves, and this is the same for everyone. It doesn't matter if you're a single mother with 3 kids or if you're like a 18-year graduate or something. So I think that that's why I'm criticizing it, because the problem is that you enable the access to social provisions, but the problem is that if you do not actually have enough money for cultural production, then these people actually cannot make their living. So the point of the law is to kind of allow freelancers and people who want to be artists as professionals to legally be able to do it, but on the other hand, the general economic situation doesn't allow you to survive as a freelance artist. And I also agree that yes, the institutions are totally closed, and that's why I think this law came about. Because if you look at how many institutions were established in the last 50 years, you can see that I don't have the data here, but what was going on was that all these academies for arts and all the, let's say, programs which are connected with future, somebody who wants to work in the field of culture, like cultural studies and all the humanities programs, all these universities in Slovenia constantly enroll the same number of people in the university. So of course there were too many people, and they should. That's why I think that's why they had to also implement the law, because there were too many people and they couldn't employ them, but they had to somehow legally arrange them so that they could, at least have that feeling, and that's why I think that there's a problem with this law.
I just want to add that more than 2/3 of independent cultural workers, they don't earn minimum wage.
Yeah.
So, but on the other hand, the state invests more than 5 million euros for their social security. This is really a paradox.
Yeah, it is, but even if they would invest 5 million in their art production, I don't think that would make things better. I'm not sure if that would be the solution.
Okay, thank you. Do we have another question? Yes, Asta.
Okay, yeah. But I also agree that the status of independent cultural workers, it's not only for artists. So I think that this, what you just said is sort of, it's not either or this or that, but it's all at the same time. You had at the status you have artists who may or may never be employed in the institution, and you also have curators, writers, everything actually, and that is why this status sort of helps the precarization on the cultural field. Not only because of artists, but because of everybody else who uses this status, especially the institutions who uses this status not to employ their workers, but you can be self-employed. And this is not seen only on the cultural field, but also in other fields, like in constructions, in theaters. You have people who are technicians or some sort of maybe even actors that are not, they don't, their work is not something that requires this status, but they have it because this way they are cheaper. I think this is the problem with this status, and I think that if one would look at the numbers, that's why there are so many more people on this status, and it's easier to get this status, or maybe not easier, but it's a difference with this status than the regular self-employed, because of this that you can get paid the social contribution. So that I would say that this is the inflation, which naturally contributes to precarization in cultural sphere. And regarding with the concept of autonomy in art, I would say that this concept, which has been not invented, but which has been with art since the invention of the institution of art, so since 18th and beginning of 19th century, I would say this is the most maybe capitalist concept of them all, because it sort of allows artists producers, and on the other hand, state, church, or the market to disguise the real meaning of art and to disguise and to fog this relationship between money, market, and the artwork or artist. And this has not changed really so much since the beginning of this conception, since the beginning of capitalism, and maybe even before in some other forms of state. But I would say that it is also very practical to just in a way of thinking of how to sponsor art or how to have art as something as part of the state. So that is why I wouldn't say that even in Yugoslavia, Czech Republic, or in other socialist countries before, they changed it. They used the same mechanism to sponsor art and the same principles of art market, just that it wasn't really art market, it was state-founded market, and the same concept of how to value art or how to make art something better, which artists would be paid or not, are just the same as now. And I think that this is why, as I agree with you and your last thought on your paper, this is why it's really tricky and hard to think, because you have to, there are no mechanism or concept you can just use simply to apply them in socialist society, because I wouldn't say that we have a really good model from history. I think it's just the same.
Yeah, thank you for the comments. Yeah, I think it's great. I mean, yeah, I think I should have also stressed the fact that the law for the independent cultural workers actually included not only artists but other like I said, other art professionals. So I think that that's a totally, yeah, it's a great point that you're making. And I also agree that, yeah, the problem of this economy is that, yeah, the position of art within, I mean, socialist Yugoslavia had